Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
And good evening or good afternoon, as the case may be. This is Peter Robbins. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth, and this is our very first show of the year. And you'll notice I keep disappearing. That may happen for reasons that are completely beyond me, but that I'm hoping will not permeate the show. Before we get to our very first guest, one who I'm very much looking forward to chatting with of the year, I just wanted to complete some thoughts from our last show on the 26th of December, which was a show about books, readers, reading, and the writers that we love. Had a number of friends on. We talked about quite a few dozen books, and two that I left out that I did want you to be aware of. I just want to go over quickly. About a year ago, a book came to my attention called The Big Book of Mars. And it's by an author named Mark Hartzman. And I see him off camera again. There I am. There's The Big Book of Mars. And it's a great book for everybody that loves Mars and has since they were kids. Very photo rich, all kinds of information, beautifully laid out. And that led me to another book of Hartzman's, which is called Chasing Ghosts, which is his relative adventures in the world of ghost hunting and all things spooky and paranormal. These led me to the book I wanted to discuss with you, or just mention to you tonight. It's just fun from beginning to end. It's historical fiction, and it's called The Embalmed Head of Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, who, as some of you know, was a very important figure in England, who actually, and I am on camera, and hooray, who ruled for a period of time until the king was executed, and then after, died a natural death. But when the king's son came to power, somewhat vindictive, he had Cromwell's body taken back to the surface and chopped off its head. And that's a historical fact. What isn't historical fact, but makes for great fun reading, is the history of more than 300 years as told by Oliver Cromwell's head. And for an American to accomplish this as well as he did, in just the right kind of cadence and English dialect that you would hope, but is not unrecognizable, he takes us through his adventures as a disembodied head. It's great fun. It is good historical fiction, and I just recommend it as a break. It's a thinking person's wonderfully goofy book. And 25 years ago, for a period of time, in the summer of 1997, I was a best-selling author in a foreign country. The country was the Kingdom. That's 4 countries. The United Kingdom. The book that I'd co-written about Britain's Rendlesham Forest UFO incident was in the top 10 best-selling books in the country within a few short weeks. It was a very heady experience, very exciting. And within about 3 weeks, the book was hovering at number 7, 2 points below the newest book by one of my favorite authors then and still. If you look to number 9, it's The Tailor of Panama. a book by John le Carre, possibly the greatest espionage fiction writer in the English language. And if you don't think that that was one of the most exciting the most exciting literary experience of my life, think again. And for all these many years, I have been enjoying that little buzz. Last month, I came upon the book at a book sale and bought it. I had seen the movie with the very likable Pierce Brosnan. As almost always, the book was much better. And it also broke an illusion that I had had for a quarter of a century. Yes, we were 2 points ahead of Mr. Carre in June of 1997, but his book was published in 1996. It had been on the bestseller list in the UK for more than half a year and was just starting to slip. That understood, they still can't take away from me that feeling, even though the book crashed and burned years after that in Scandal, that wonderful gift that John le Carre inadvertently gave me that I always hoped when I met him I could bring up as conversation starter at a cocktail party. But being that he's dead now almost 2 years, I expect that experience will have to wait. That said, tonight's guest, and I'm so happy to have him back on, is the former co-director of the J.Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, where he, and that is Donald R. Schmitt, served as director of special investigations for 10 years. Prior to that, he was a special investigator for Dr. Hynek. Schmitt is a 7-time best-selling author, for real. Not that I wasn't. He is also, his book, The UFO Crash at Roswell, was made into the Golden Globe-nominated movie Roswell. And his book, Witness to Roswell, was the #1 best-selling UFO book in the world for 2 straight years. Don is also chief investigator of the International UFO Museum and Research Center in Roswell, New Mexico. Don Schmitt, welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth.
Peter, always a pleasure to be back with you. And what a way to kick off the year. What a way to end the previous, because here we are once again.
Yes.
And
And
precipice
in that spirit of here we are once again,
yeah.
I thought we might start by me coming and going off your screen. But aside from that, I thought we might start with a little perspective on where we stand at the moment. The we being those of us who've maintained a dedicated interest in the subject for years, if not decades, along with that growing number of the public at large who are taking the subject increasingly seriously. When you and I think about those abbreviations, UFO, UAP, and their implications for humanity, we are faced with an assortment of possibilities, each with its own particular area of study, just as in any other area of natural learning. Our conversation this evening will generally center around just one area of possibility that comes under the broader umbrella of UFOs, UAPs, that being hard metal machines of highly advanced technology under intelligent control and of undetermined origin. That said, could you or I have imagined half a dozen years ago even where we would be right now in this, I'll say, post-disclosure era? Some might say post New York Times, December of 2017, but things have changed. Could you have imagined this really half a dozen years ago, where we are right now compared to where we were for 70 years?
Yes and no. And for this reason, I often have mentioned how I would hearken back to the time that the Air Force was officially involved. We had a common phenomenon that we were diligently working to demonstrate, to establish, and yet we had a common foe. And the idea that it was a branch of the United States military, no less, United States Air Force, that clearly was running interference, was not playing fair with the facts, was doing all they could to essentially deceive the public as to their own ignorance of what they were dealing with. And the fact that their very scientist, their very consultant, Dr. J.Allen Hynek, who would start out as their chief debunker and then would, arrive at this epiphany. It was slow in coming, but nonetheless, that Hynek realized that we were dealing with an actual phenomenon, that there were cases that could not be explained away. And Hynek finally had to accept the fact that all these witnesses, whether they were military or commercial pilots or even civilians, in many cases were PhDs, were teachers, were scientists who were beyond reproach, that they couldn't all be liars, that they were all describing the exact same phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so the irony that the Air Force would wash their hands of it with the disbanding, the closing down, the shutting down of Blue Book at the end of 1969. Hynek would start the Center for UFO Studies in the fall of 1973. I would start on with Hynek right out of college in 78. And we've come this full circle. We're back to where many of us had hoped the government would take us at that time. And we have to be careful that we don't treat this as anything that outstanding, that new, because we had the potential of the congressional hearings back in 66. And we had the likes of the late Dr. James McDonald.
Yes.
Who in many respects was way ahead of the game, way ahead of even Hynek, in his acceptance that we were dealing with something, we were dealing with someone else's hardware manufactured off this planet. And to see McDonald raked through the coals by no less than the late Senator Ted Kennedy. And Kennedy trying to, because at the time, McDonald was a big supporter of supersonic air travel, the SST. And for whatever reason, Kennedy felt it was a lost cause, that we are not going to be able to have commercial aircraft that are going to travel supersonic. And he tied McDonald in with this technology, and that just for that reason alone, he shouldn't be trusted, he shouldn't be believed. And now on top of it, he's claiming we're being visited by, as far as aircraft from another planet, that type of thing. So it was the same politics that was being played back at that time, back in 66. Now, granted, that's way before our time, Peter. But nonetheless, we have to learn from the lessons of history. We have to be careful that if we allow UFOs, UAPs, to once again become a political pawn, we won't advance, we won't move the ball any further than it had moved back at that time.
Before we go on, Dr. McDonald, for both of us, has been a real hero.
True hero.
True inspiration. He literally gave his life for the subject,
yes.
Not even allegorically, and suffered tremendously the humiliation of ridicule.
Yes.
And when Kennedy decided to really put the pressure on McDonald, he didn't do it himself. A senator from New York named Ryan humiliated Dr. McDonald in the voir dire, so to say, and wired him up completely with flying saucers and little green men. And so what if he's a distinguished atmospheric physicist and just the right person for this job? He believes in flying saucers, so he's nuts. If one believes in karma, maybe it's just an accident of fate. Ryan was contacted right before the tragedy in Jonestown, Guyana, by
Oh, yes, the Jim
constituents of
Jones,
his
yes. Mhm.
who were in the Jim Jones cult. And he took it upon himself, I think in part, as a matter of showboating and wanting to put himself on the international stage. He flew down there and
He
he was
flew
shot
down
to
to
death on the
Jonestown.
tarmac. He
Yes,
didn't get out
yes.
of that. He just got out of the airplane and he was dead.
Mhm,
And I couldn't help thinking back,
mhm.
anyway, the lessons of history right now relative to the subject are in struggle. Life is expansion and contraction, as are historic events. The expansion of the beginning of this process, I won't even call it a disclosure process, but it is on a certain level by definition, in 2020 was the most extraordinary expansion that those of us in the field of general UFO studies had experienced. Period. From the get go, things seem to have taken a turn and changed and may well have. But it's natural that a contraction will follow. Those people who are in power who are maybe more anxious than they felt they might be or than they want to be relative to this information now being generally not made fun of, which is the worst thing that could happen to them. It was the greatest secret keeping device ever
Mhm.
devised, and I think it was partially accidental, but it was brilliant and very effective. That
For over
there need
70 years. For over 70 years, yes.
there need to clamp down, so to say. Um, maybe one can say it's just an endemic sort of part of the DNA of secret keepers. But it occurred to me that in the past few years, that people have stuck their heads out of where they are and said, I've always been interested in this subject, but never wanted to express it because I know people would make fun of me. And now many of these people are well known. They are allowing themselves something that we experienced initially decades ago when something captured our interest about this subject to such a degree that we became somewhat obsessed with it and started to dig and fill our minds with it and wonder larger and dream larger. It's very interesting to see that very human phenomena going on with certain key people in government. Others are posers, so to say. They see a good thing or they see something that is timely and that they can attach their name to and look like a vanguardist or something. But it is a very interesting moment in terms of human behavior and officialdom, if you know what I mean.
And you're quite correct, Peter, that this is now the ball has moved beyond where we were
Yeah.
in 66 with the hearings at that point, and then with the closing of Blue Book, and then with Hynek, with the founding of the Center for UFO Studies in 73, and at a press conference stating that he was confident that they would have an answer within the first year.
Gosh.
And so we've learned not to outrun our headlights, so to speak. The phenomenon has subsisted with us, without us. It seems to be here in spite of us in many respects. Whatever its agenda may be, we just happen to be, casual observers at times. And at times there is an interaction, but even with the interaction, we haven't been able to provide the bona fides to say, here is the conclusive proof beyond a shadow of a doubt. We're reliant still on eyewitness testimony. But then what is history? But people recounting what they witnessed, what they experienced. We can't disqualify, history as we know it, and also disqualify all the UFO history.
Yeah.
It remains intact, and only that which we know of, what we're aware of. Just imagine the wealth of information accumulated not only by the Air Force, but then, as we've also discussed this, Peter, when Project Blue Book was declassified in 1977 during the Carter administration.
Yeah.
And to wade through the 13,000 cases, 701 which remained unexplained. You can't claim that you have solved a mystery with 701 mysteries remaining. I'm sorry. But they did. And the press went along with it. But what we were quickly pointing out was we were asking, okay, this was an Air Force report. Yet Blue Book was defined as all encompassing to the Department of Defense. And yet we were asking, well, where are all the Navy reports? Where are all the Army, the Marines, National Guard? There were about a dozen Navy reports of those 13,000 case investigations.
Yeah.
And yet the Navy has greater global coverage than the Air Force certainly does. What became of all of their investigations? And we started to look into that. And it isn't ironic that within the last 5 years, that's exactly what we have been focusing on. The Navy, the pilots, as far as the whole incident, as far as with like Dave Fravor, as far as the pilots and Graves and Dietrich, for example. 3 outstanding pilots that were brave enough to step forward and say what we witnessed defied the laws of physics. It was beyond ours or anyone else's technology.
Yeah.
And that was enough to get the press finally saying, well, wait a minute. There's something here. We don't know what it is. We're going to lean towards it being someone's technology of an earthly nature. But nonetheless, maybe we need to, come up to speed. Well, I'm still waiting for a reporter to say, I've looked back at the history. I've looked back at the shortcomings. I've looked back at a lot of the cover-up nature of this situation. And there's got to be more here. And sadly, because we're dealing with the 24-hour news cycle,
yeah,
we can understand how they aren't going to catch up to this. They're not going to become new experts on the subject. And that's where you and I, and that's where our colleagues need to always step to the fore and remind them that we have a tremendous wealth of knowledge concerning the subject. Because while the Air Force was playing the shell game and saying, don't look behind the curtain, we were pulling it back every chance, every opportunity we got. And we saw that there was a phenomenon that defied earthly explanation. And isn't it wonderful that the media and the government is finally looking into it? And it's like, well, welcome aboard. But the train left 75 years ago.
The term cognitive dissonance.
Of course.
I think it really applies here in that those individuals who have rejected this premise, which for us is more than a premise, because in one way or another, it's really too uncomfortable to incorporate, to contemplate, to seriously consider. Because if any of these allegations are true, then almost everything that we thought we knew about certain areas of study in nature, culture, history are now open to question. And
Yes.
that is just too much bother to the established order. And so we construct our defenses, we construct our arguments, and for each one, we can parry back. And short of that individual being abducted or having an overwhelming, truly, undeniably paranormal, anomalous experience, they are holding fast to better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. I think that this subject
Exactly.
advances arithmetically, not geometrically. And every day there are more people that take it seriously, understand they're in a climate where if they take it seriously in a more verbal way than just thinking about it, they're not going to get attacked or called, silly or what have you. All that's good. But question for you is, when I first contemplated what official disclosure might be and the challenges to it, the idea of saying we're not alone in the universe and some UFOs are machines from other places and we don't know where they're from and we don't know whether we have a problem, at least taking it that far would, of course, be amazing. But how can I say, the fact that we have a preponderance of evidence, people like you and I no longer have the luxury of disbelief, I'll say. How do you dig half a hole? How do you say we're not alone in the universe and there are other intelligences that come and go, and still do what we're doing right now and keep that barricade in place for anything remotely exotic? A crash not far from a small town back in 1947 called Roswell. Back engineering, alien beings created by aliens that are part us and part them, missing pregnancies, hybrid babies. We know somewhere there are meetings around these things. And from the results that we're seeing, there is a commitment to hold that line, to welcome discussion of the stuff that's safe to talk about. And now that includes extraordinary looking craft seen by official military observers and highly trained professionals. But how or where do you see this starting to break through or making that jump? Is it possible to even conceive of that right now?
Well, one of the things that we've observed just even recently, the fact that they have expanded even the scope of investigation, whereas heretofore it was limited strictly to aerial objects. The fact that they now are even considering underwater, hybrid craft that are able to go into the water, come out of the water, and once again become craft that we have nothing even close to. And acknowledging that objects are being tracked at just unbelievable underwater speed that just boggles the mind. And I never thought I would see an acknowledgement of these cases that you and I both knew about, that we had heard of. I mean, there was a famous case off the British Isles back in around 1966, and there too, where it allegedly was tracked by sonar at hundreds of miles an hour. And so even at that time, to now see them broaden as far as the depth of their investigation, and that they now have, as far as both the Senate, I believe the Senate, I may have them mixed. The Senate is going back to 1947 and Congress to 45. It's either one or the other, but the fact that they finally are acknowledging that the phenomena does go back, at least post World War II. And when the skies were still rather virgin, were pristine, no satellites, both jet and rocket propulsion were in their infancy at that time. So we're talking about limited alternative explanations. Today, between drones and sophisticated technology, even holographic projection and lasers, I don't get excited about anything I read or see nowadays. There's just so many alternative explanations. But back at that time, it was either one or the other. It was either, and certainly it wasn't Russian. Russian was, totally, in a process of rebuilding after, being invaded by Germany during World War II. China was a third world country, didn't even have, an airplane to its name back at that time.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at? So I think it was one of the reasons that even with Operation Paperclip, with the Nazi scientists that were brought here, that we were there, if you look back at the FBI files, that they were seriously looking at the possibility that someone else had acquired German technology post World War II and was using it to create sophisticated new aircraft. But that too was quickly eliminated because we were dealing with a technology that defied conventional explanation. We were dealing with a technology that made us look like we were still in the Stone Age. And isn't it interesting too, Peter, that we're also now, like, as we never heard with the government / military until just the last couple years, not only the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but also, are we dealing with time travel? Are we dealing with interdimensional travel? And then to hear, at least from my sources within the military, that there's a high number of personnel at the Pentagon that truly accepts that we're dealing with something interdimensional. And that's one of the problems that they have, in that it's not enough to just disclose that we're dealing with something off the planet, but now we're dealing with something that's here coexisting with us. It's able to pop in and out at will. When it slips into our dimension, it becomes hardware. But then when it slips out, there's nothing that we can put. We can't go across the street and kick the tires, so to speak.
You make a wonderful point by reminding me of this historic official acknowledgement of unidentified underwater craft, objects, activity. If you've ever seen, photo footage of a bullet being fired into water, it enters very quickly and it slows down incredibly fast.
Absolutely.
If you've ever, even as a kid, remember trying to swim as fast as you can and just remembering the natural resistance of water. A book that any of our viewers or listeners might want to check out or add to their library, even though it's 50 years old, it's still very much worth having, is the great Ivan T. Sanderson's book, Invisible Residents, which is the first book published on this subject. Sanderson began his career as a mammalian biologist, writing about, big jungle animals, and ended up in this area of study and quite a bit of research and investigation into Sasquatch, Bigfoot, etc. Right. But I'll never forget the impact of the opening of Invisible Residents on me. He's a very fine writer, and he hit the floor running in that book. You can find used copies online for a couple of bucks. Invisible Residents, Ivan T. Sanderson. But very good point. That was, in fact, an admission of something exotic that went beyond my original premise there. Very good.
And I'm glad you mentioned Sanderson, because others of his ilk at that time, like the late John Keel, that they were wonderful writers, and that they painted such a visual impression of what had transpired. And okay, we would accept that they would have taken creative license and they would have filled in gaps. Okay, fine. But it did not in any way dismiss the fact that they were working from an actual case report, that there were eyewitnesses who described something that defied conventional explanation. And it'd be no different than to have a Steven Spielberg portray like a Kelly Hopkinsville incident that I know he's wanted to do this for years. And it was even suggested that even E.T., the movie E.T., was even loosely based on that. But nonetheless, it's the visual. That's what we have to continue to demonstrate beyond the written word, that people, when they grasp that, it's one thing to read a report, but when you actually are able to visualize what someone encountered, what they experienced, and then to come away and go, that was explained the way as a weather balloon? that was explained the way as the case of Kelly Hopkinsville, as monkeys from a carnival, that type of thing. We have to ask, if we place ourselves in the same situation, would we have, just casually overreacted to something of that nature? Or, my God, what's it going to take to convince you?
Yeah. It's so interesting how the resistance, the general resistance that it all goes back to, in so many words, men in power finding a way to step back and relinquish control of the truth is very difficult for men in power, because the whole illusion of them being in power is defined by often something other than the truth. And I guess it challenges so many basic human notions that even now, as things open up more, we're going to feel them also pulling back. And there is a struggle going on. Obviously, there are people in government that want to let this go, at least to some greater degree than they are, and others who perhaps they're third generation, even secret keepers. This is their holy pact. This is what they do. And we must protect ourselves from ourselves, because if this is real, then if we're made in God's image, whose image are they made in? And other such questions that could come up for the scientific or theological mind. And these are the things I think that are still being struggled with.
Well, as our dear departed colleague and friend, Stanton Friedman, used to remind us, that here on planet Earth, nationalism is the name of the game.
Yeah.
We owe our allegiance, we pay our taxes, we reside under the governance of individual countries, individual elected officials, and that they're in that level of control. And to acknowledge an existence off the planet for the first time in our history, we become earthlings overnight.
Yep.
Borders are erased. We're all on this collective spaceship called planet Earth. And do we then start to behave as depicted in my favorite UFO movie, as it was Hynek's The Day the Earth Stood Still?
Behave or else.
Behave or else. You are part of now the galactic neighborhood, and we expect you to be a good behaving neighbor. You will honor the covenant as we spell it out, and don't paint your house pink without our approval, so to speak.
You bring up a terribly important point here, which is, without nationalism, it's very difficult for the individuals who are past control of nations and nation states to keep everybody fired up. We're on this side of the line. We're the best. You're on that side of the line. We don't trust you. And we are involved in an activity we've been doing for several millennium. And I'll say man instead of mankind, because it doesn't really seem to be something that women have championed over the millennium, which is, you have crossed the line that we drew in the dirt, and so we have to kill you because you're on our side of the line. And that's the way it is. And again, all of the notions of decency that inform the best science fiction in so many ways, the best positive science fiction of, you've got to grow up a little bit before we'll even talk to you. And after 76 years now or so, you're not doing a very good job. In fact, isn't it interesting that politically right now we're in the same variations of usual nationalism versus nationalism, and then the sides being taken turmoil at the moment of this real revolution in a perception about UFOs and their implications. I don't know if they're hardwired in together, but it doesn't surprise me that they're superimposed in the same period of time.
It also comes back to, Peter, why the curiosity why would a higher intelligence even give us the time of day? Now, granted, there hasn't been the proverbial landing on the White House front lawn. And again, to even cite Stanton Friedman, as he would point out, that just imagine what is the primary theme that comes across to any outside force that is monitoring our daily radio and TV broadcasts and our just the newscasts of our daily behavior, that we're a barbaric species of people whose primary function is tribal warfare. So then the question, has anything changed in 2,000 years, in 5,000 years? When you think, I'd like to believe, and I remember I was working out at the gym at the time, and it was after the incident in Las Vegas with the mass shooting. And, everybody was commenting about how terrible. And of course it was. It was tragic beyond, anyone's comprehension. But I found myself quickly commenting, but keep in mind, I was telling people, 99.9% of us don't resort to that. We don't settle our problems, our disagreements that way. We do get along. We are good neighbors.
Yes.
And so, as Arthur would always espouse in, Camelot, we are civilized. And for those of us who feel we have matured to that level, and as you and I, Peter, have often, contemplated, are we ready? You and I have been ready for years. It's not going to change your life. It's not going to change my life at all.
We'll be a little busier, maybe.
And hopefully we would be. We won't be forgotten in that regard. But I always, and excuse me again for harkening back to Roswell.
Please.
And the reason I bring it up is whenever some, learned, professor will always, be quick to remind us, well, there would be this mass panic and there would be this culture shock and things would never be the same. And I go back to 1947 and I say, well, for those that were there at the time, and this was an unprecedented situation. There was nothing in the Army manual. They couldn't, they had to rely on their instincts. They had to just, do the job at hand and then contemplate what had transpired maybe days and weeks later. And then it hit them. But nonetheless, there was no panic. There was no mass suicide. These people, they lived out their lives. They worked their jobs. They even continued going to church from all accounts.
Yep.
And they were there. They experienced this firsthand. And they lived through it.
Yep.
And here we are, going on 76 years later, and we've grown up with the space program. We've grown up with Star Trek and Star Wars, and E.T. and Close Encounters. So we've been thoroughly conditioned. We have been educated to accept this, not to the contrary. And so we can no longer allow this to be a cop-out excuse. We're just protecting the public. No, you're not. You're protecting yourselves. You're the ones that are having a difficult time dealing with the acceptance, dealing with the very thought, the very consideration that we're dealing with an intelligence off the planet.
We
For
pointed
those
out
of us who have been closely aligned with it, those of us who have been working on it every day of our lives, of our adult lives.
We pointed out a number of times in our conversations that it's almost like we live in a world where there are sleepwalkers, many of them extremely decent people, but to whom this subject isn't even worthy of considering a reality, because the mantra, if it was, it can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it's something else. And if it was true, there'd be no way to keep a secret this big. Well, wrong. It worked very well for a great deal of time. And the
Peter,
fact that,
we
yeah,
both personally know it has been leaking out. There have been whistleblowers
yeah,
since the beginning. The problem is the media, as well as the public, have been conditioned not to accept it. So it's due to that level of ridicule. I mean, who's going to step forward and risk loss of their reputation, loss of their career
yep.
in describing something that is treated as though it is a totally a taboo topic?
Boy. The late great Stanton Friedman also pointed out, and although he's such a pragmatist, I don't even know if he'd feel comfortable referring to him as a visionary, but he saw things a lot clearer, a lot earlier than a lot of us did.
Yes, he
And
did.
one of them was, this kind of noble idea that a lot of us like to hold on to, that at the highest levels of human governance, there's a certain a good quality whereby we want the best for our constituents, our people, our citizens, as opposed to just hold on like hell to the power that we have, say anything that we need to keep on it, and retire comfortably. What Stan pointed out was for governments per se, i.e., in great part increasingly under the pressure of the military-industrial complex, what this is all about is not enlightenment, it's not understanding, it's not unity with other intelligences, it's hardware.
Right.
Whoever can back engineer and crack and weaponize this first, they win. They've got the biggest gun around and they can call the shots. And that, unfortunately, is still what appeals to the minds of people who aspire to control the lives of the rest of us. It's a giant chess game. And you and I, partly of our job is to just keep addressing the nonsense that's put forward in place of rational thinking, of genuine evidence, of pragmatically moving forward.
Well, we have to keep in mind, Peter, that the number one issue confronting Capitol Hill is national security. That they now find themselves questioning, why haven't we been briefed on this situation?
Yeah.
When our own state representative, Mike Gallagher, at the congressional hearings in June, actually brought up Malmstrom in 1967 and that entire line of Atlas missiles that were disabled, that were shut down by that UFO. And I'm sorry, it's in the records. I mean, there was a UFO, there was an unknown craft that had infiltrated the base at that time. You want to believe it was Chinese or Russian, go right ahead. Then we're even in greater trouble. It was a genuine UFO.
That we are.
But the point being that if I'm sitting in Washington, I should be screaming bloody murder. Why are we not being briefed on this situation on a regular basis?
Yeah.
Why are they still acting so very cavalierly as to, well, when you get around to it? But as you just pointed out, Peter, the only concern the military has is the technological breakthrough, the reverse engineering of the technology. How will it advance their power, their control? Because that's the only reason the military exists at all is essentially kill and destroy. That's what they do.
I have to say, for me, and I think for you, one of the most extraordinary byproducts of living the lives that we do is, in a way, an indication of the extraordinarily unique value that people come in together understanding that there is something real here and that it affects us all and may infect us all interesting choice of words, affect instead of infect us all as we move further into the future, which is that our work brings us into contact, has brought us into contact with people from all over the world who we
Absolutely.
would have never possibly interfaced with, connected with, spoken with, become acquaintances, made friends with. And that's dangerous again for the forces that be. The moment you do establish a contact like that with somebody who previously was a stranger, the enemy, who represented the unknown, the challenges of the future, and it's demystified, you see yourself more and more as a citizen of the world rather than just your home country. And that makes you hard to control because your deepest instincts and impulses have to do with humanity rather than just the group that you're associated with, no matter how much you love your country or your fellow countrymen and women.
All excellent points, Peter. And the point that I would emphasize, and I mention this whenever I deal with a journalist, a reporter, in that they need to keep in mind that whenever they rely on a government/military official as a source for information, that information will be very limited, very controlled.
Yes.
We don't know how much access these sources have to the truth. We don't know that they're nothing more than pawns, useful idiots that are just spreading disinformation. We don't know that. But in our case, the shoes that we walk in, we're not under such bounds. We're not under such control. That's why whenever someone talks about, well, I have a military source, yeah, but they're still connected. They're not going to say anything more that will potentially get them in trouble, lose their pension, put them in prison because they're under security oaths. You and I are not. And as a result, I have often felt that they see just how far we're going to push the envelope, how far we're going to take this, because we're doing the job that they can't. Yes. Peter, I can't tell you how often I have had high-ranking military officers take me aside and say, we wish you all the success in the world because you're doing what we can't. And they're applauding us on the sidelines. And so I think it's one of the reasons that has compelled me all the more to stay in the race. And as you've heard me say in the past, it doesn't matter who wins, because when the truth comes out, we all win. We all win. Doesn't matter who.
The fact that, you know, we live with statements like the truth shall set you free. I'm not sure. You know, it may be a dark freedom for a lot of people, absolutely realizing in an undeniable way, but it's simply the way that it is. And you can live in a fantasy or understand that the fantasy, that you've been accusing others of living in. And it before we go to break, it reminds me that, yes, we have not bound by an official pledge of secrecy. We are bound by our honor, our conscience, etc. But when we enter the wonderful world of UFO research, for lack of a more inclusive term, we basically walk into a Wild West saloon where it's a little like the scene from Star Wars, and you have people who take positions, who are well known in the work, who are lesser known in the work, who are looking for a reputation, who will make allegations of things that they can't fully prove and that you cannot prove that are wrong. And so it's, believe me, because I know I'm telling the truth when I'm really not, but this is kind of an exciting place to be right now. And, you know, it's just flying saucers anyway. Who's really telling the truth? You really want to grab people by the shoulders sometime and shake them, but they're invisible people in the internet.
Well, as you and I both would say, we're talking about the biggest story of the millennium.
Yep.
We shouldn't have to defend our involvement. I mean, I question, how can you not be excited? How can you not be enthralled and just, craving information on a story this big? And we're in the midst of it. What an adventure. What an adventure.
That we are. And we have just blown through the first hour of our adventure for this show. We will be back in 4 minutes. Please return, and we'll see you back here then.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Are we alone in the universe? The most important question facing humanity is on the verge of being settled once and for all. The Mutual UFO Network has been at the forefront of this journey for nearly 50 years. Our members worldwide are dedicated to the research, documentation, and awareness that will shape the future of humanity. Won't you join us?
It's not just a donation.
It's a warm blanket.
It's a bottle of clean water.
It's a roof and a bed.
It's knowing someone cares.
It's feeling safe.
It's a today that's better than yesterday.
Every dollar you can spare helps so much more than you can imagine. Please, donate now to help people affected by Hurricane Ian. Your support is urgently needed.
Discover the Observation Deck, a one-of-a-kind virtual event platform that takes video conferencing to the next level by using avatars to navigate a campus. There's so many areas and activities to choose from. There's a 1,000-seat auditorium, an expo hall, a nightclub, and even a beach. So come attend a conference, take a class, or hear a lecture on the incredible Observation Deck campus. Go to theobservationdk.com.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected, only at kgradb.com.
We're back with Meanwhile Here on Earth with Peter Robbins and my special guest to start the year off, Donald R. Schmitt. Don, let's talk a bit about something that has just happened involving, you mentioned earlier, your friend and colleague, Robert Salas. Robert, as many of you know, was involved in a nuclear missile UFO incident where these what are they's literally shut off the ability to launch in 1967. Bob has been a very vocal and very outspoken and very articulate proponent of paying attention to these many reports, which any one of them should be enough to turn. It's a real paradigm shifter. But again, denial, as they say, isn't just a river in Egypt. Just last week, on the 24th, Christmas Eve, Bob said, quote, "I've recently been contacted by an intermediary to provide testimony on the 1967 Maelstrom Air Force Base UFO incidents to the All-Domain Anomalous Resolution Office." That's AARO. "I have also participated in providing names of other witnesses to nuke UFO incidents. Hopefully, this request will eventually result in public congressional hearings on this important topic. I and many others have been active in the disclosures of these incidents over the span of 27 years. It is finally getting the attention from Congress it deserves. Those shown have previously served in the House or Senate." Sorry, that's a note from a photo. But let me get myself back on camera here. We have seen Bob time after time come forward with other extraordinarily worthy of respect colleagues who have had similar, in some cases identical incidents. Do you see this playing a part in advancing the dialogue, so to say, or do you think it will continue to kind of be in the back shelf for people in power?
Well, we often contemplated at a time when hundreds of the Roswell witnesses firsthand were still with us. And should we have ever had our day in court, an opportunity to finally, as a class action, demonstrate what had actually transpired back in 1947. So with Malmstrom, you're talking 67. I'd like to believe a lot of the personnel are still with us. You consider just on that flight line alone, at that mission control, so to speak, how many of those people now that Bob could name, that could be subpoenaed, that could testify, be granted immunity, and could demonstrate beyond a shadow of a doubt not only the truth of the incident, but the fact that they, whatever represents this phenomena, was able to totally shut down an entire firing line of nuclear Atlas missiles. Now, if that doesn't get your attention, then nothing will. Nothing will. And so Bob has been one of the people that he has testified at the Washington Press Club on numerous occasions. He was with us when we testified at the citizens' hearing in 2013. I know last summer he also had testified at invitation of the Brazilian Senate with our vice president of the International Coalition on Extraterrestrial Research, Gary Hesseltine. So Bob was able to testify before the Brazilian government on what has happened. And now he's finally invited, hopefully, to testify by an interim. It's not like he's testifying in front of Dr. Jean Kirkpatrick, who's the head of AARO, but hopefully she will be briefed. She will be fully educated as to Bob's testimony. I hope that this serves as a springboard for potentially hundreds of other whistleblowers. And Peter, we've talked about this for years, that without protection of insiders, without protection of military sources, whether SAC, Strategic Air Command officers, pilots, both military and commercial, because we've even seen like the O'Hare incident, that even commercial pilots are ordered not to say anything. So this has to be lifted once and for all. And if this will have this domino effect. And I think it would be wonderful that Bob would lead that charge.
Yeah.
Because he's not getting any younger either. And there needs to be some resolution. I mean, these people just can't be betrayed by their own governments, the governments that they serve, the governments that they enlisted as far as serving within the military and went on to become officers, and then to be treated as though for doing nothing more than experiencing something out of the ordinary and reporting on it and going public and saying, I don't care what the reprisal, I don't care how I'm going to be as far as smeared. The public needs to know that this is happening. And I think it's more than about time. I think it's well deserved, and we all wish Bob Godspeed.
This is, we say government, and it's such a headless, gutless maw. It's like some kind of amoeba, and it's defined by whatever we're comfortable with the word. When we say the government ought to, in this case, we think of the Roswell witnesses, as well as the witnesses to these particular accounts, who are aging out, all of them now, at least in their 80s, I guess, or coming into it. A thing that I know makes you as furious as it does me is officialdom's strategy when there's no other card to play, to ignore these people and wait for them to die. And then you're free of them. If they wrote something down somewhere, it doesn't have nearly the impact of seeing them say it into a camera. And again, we come back to this issue of witness testimony. As you've said, what we call history is defined by it. Before the later 1830s, there were no such thing as cameras to record visual images. It's all history that's passed down. And to give this special place to somebody that they says they saw something in the sky that they could not identify, that you're a special case. We'd be happy to take your word for this, except that you may be delusional. You may want to feel special. You may want to be a hoaxer. Perhaps you're some kind of mystic. I don't know. I just don't trust anybody who says that they saw something like that, because I'm conditioned to think that way. How, again, except for doing what we do and continuing to clarify where possible, or point people toward what we consider respectable pieces of research and information, is there anything coming at us this year that you see may turn the tide a bit, or anything that you feel we should be on the lookout for that is hatching away, so to say, in the back rooms of Washington, D.C. and around the world?
What we do have to be careful for, and you talked about at a certain point that the Pentagon will be backed into a corner. And in what way would they push back? Well, we know, again, based on history, that as the Air Force was under greater and greater scrutiny, specifically by the media, and then after the Dexter Ann Arbor situation in 1966 in Michigan, and you had then Michigan congressman, yet to become president, Gerald Ford, who was one of the instruments of the congressional hearings at that time.
Yes.
And we need a number, we need beyond a Gerald Ford, or as we had, working with the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, and before him, the late Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. We need a number of elected officials. It's though Washington always allows one individual, they put him out on the limb or her out on the limb, they dangle them as far as to see what the public response, what the reaction is going to be. and they're not brave enough to unite, circle their wagons, and say, we're going to get to the bottom of this once and for all. And what I'm concerned about is that, as we've demonstrated in the past, that we will give the Pentagon so much time to prepare a report. Well, they were supposed to have completed their report by the end of last year. Actually, by the end of November.
Yeah.
And here we sit once again. We provide them with an out, as though this is the first time. But they've done this for 75, going on 76 years. So what we have to be careful of is that the Pentagon doesn't say, well, to demonstrate just how genuine we are, just how willing we are to cooperate, we're going to allow a private study outside of our ranks. So we would have a repeat of the infamous Condon Committee that we had in 66 through 68. All preconceived. It was a whitewash, as Hynek himself even called it. They had a mission, and it was not to look into the reality of the phenomena. It was essentially provide a scapegoat for the military, for the Air Force at that time. And I'm concerned about the fact that now NASA, just out of nowhere, because NASA wasn't willing to look at this when Jimmy Carter was president.
Not at all.
He asked NASA to look into it, and they refused. But now they are. When they can't even launch a successful rocket to the moon after 50 years. But now they're going to look into UFOs. And we should all pay note of the fact there isn't anyone knowledgeable on the subject that's part of their committee. Not a one. Not a one. So
I think we're still dealing in part with this decades-old dynamic of, look, I've got my certificates and my diplomas. I've got my PhD. I've got tenure at a respected university. I've published books and papers. I've spoken at international conferences. I know my astrophysics or astronomy or whatever space science I'm involved in. Do you really think I have the time to take to read a UFO book, which will, being an important, serious, complex guy, will take time out of my busy schedule, will, if I'm caught reading it, I will be a laughingstock. You don't understand my position, as opposed to this idea of SETI and it's SETI's reincarnations. And we have to look out there when there's a complete unwillingness to look behind our backs. Because if they're here, then that's embarrassing to us yet once again. We're dealing with human dynamics here. And part of it for me, I want to know your thought on this, is we know that there are all sorts of factions in the world of UFO-related beliefs. And I think part of the problem is that people want end or answers. And those are the wrong questions to ask. Are they good or are they bad? Are they taking people or aren't they taking people? Do they want to organize us into joining the Great Confederation and being, one happy giant galactic family, or do they want to eat us for dinner? I think that we're dealing with all of these, not the dinner aspect necessarily, but we're dealing with so many possible other intelligences, other civilizations, if you will, other overriding principles or directives that they have, that we kind of choose our favorites. The wonderful X-Files mantra still dominates. I want to believe. And it's not just what I want to believe, it's what I don't want to believe.
Right.
Please don't let that be true. And so, number one, I think we're dealing with factions of people who, they're good, they're bad. I had wonderful experiences. Mine were traumatic. Therefore, you're wrong. No, you're wrong. When these are valid experiences on both sides. And is that an indication of my psychology, that I grew up defensive and worried and frightened that I'm going to see anything strange or new as a threat, or that I grew up to expect new things and welcome new experiences and make friends with strangers. And therefore, I had an easier time. Again, they're moving the chess pieces. They are the ones, this subtext that we've been talking in, this particular group of assorted beings, account for a lot of behaviors. There's a notion, I think, from some people that anybody who has served in a ranking government position of some sort, if they leave government and they've learned things about this subject or allegedly learned them, and maybe it's disinformation, but we either have to trust them or not. When they come forward, there are people who say, look at their credentials, look at their courage for coming forward. This is a voice to listen to. Or, oh, for gosh sakes, don't you know a setup when you see it? This is a plant. Remember what happened to NICAP when they made a former head of the CIA, Roscoe Hillenkotter, head of the organization, and soon there wasn't any organization. Is there a middle ground here, or what's some common sense viewing on this idea that I'm tossing around here for you, Don?
I'm concerned that many of the young people, the people that are joining our ranks, for example, already have, very likely from reading our books, reading our material, reading our case reports, that we've influenced them to the point that they enter with a preconceived acceptance. However they have derived, however they have conceived the nature of the phenomenon. And in too many cases, it borders on the fringe. It's no different than not the skeptic, but the debunker who don't bother me with the facts. As Stan would say, my mind is made up. And so we have to be careful that as the so-called senior officials, the historians within the field, that we maintain control of the reins on both sides. We have to be careful, and we both can speak to this. And it's only because there are no guideposts, there are no road signs within UFO investigation, because we're dealing with an enigma that is yet to present itself to us in whichever manner it would choose, whatever it would decide. So we're the ones that are flaying around in the dark. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow regarding this subject with this field.
That's right.
Nothing else remains this undisciplined. And I don't see how we can be held accountable for that, because it just happens to be the nature of the beast. Because if there were parameters that we all needed to abide by, we would expect the phenomenon itself to establish itself. And it hasn't. And that's why we're all willing to voice opinions. That's why we're all willing to have a personal belief as to what we're dealing with. I mean, even religion, there's a handbook, so to speak. There is not one in ufology. No. And I don't believe that even the military, like I was saying earlier, as far as back in 47, there wasn't a chapter in the Army field manual about how to deal with a crash recovery.
Bingo. Yeah,
so
we are.
We've advanced, we've taken it any further than that within our own respective field.
In a way, we are making it up as we go along. And I use the word making up in the pejorative sense, not creating a fantasy, but the form that is evolving to try to study and wrap our heads around what this is all about, at least to some degree. The history of UFO studies has been informed by bigger than life individuals to a degree, who from the get-go, either through their books or their pronouncements or their appearances become centers of attention for periods of time, as is just the nature of things. Several years ago, an individual came forward and started to talk about things they had learned. They had a government background, a former U.S. Army counterintelligence special agent and former employee of the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. I'm talking here about Luis Elizondo, who was all over the place for a prolonged period of time. You could not turn your head in this work without seeing another account of his or something of his or about him. I never met him. My nature is to hope for the best and take people at their word until they prove that they are not worthy of that. He seemed to me to be certainly on the surface a decent, hardworking individual in the service of getting information out there, but increasingly caught between a rock and a hard place. And not that many months ago, he basically just went quiet. Your thoughts about Luis Elizondo, your feelings about his authenticity, and your own contacts with him, if you don't mind my asking, Don.
And I have. I've met with him on a number of occasions. I have done some programs with him. I've met his wife on a number of occasions. And even speaking of Lou's wife, I found that she was becoming more and more concerned as to his well-being.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even questioning whether the powers that be were even using him to some extent. And at the same time, I was reminding colleagues, we have to always consider that Lou is still connected. He is still on a short leash.
Yeah.
He is only going to be able to discuss in public that which he either feels comfortable with or that which they allow him to present.
Agreed.
Now, I would bring up Roswell to Lou on a number of occasions, and he would always very politely, Don, I can't discuss that. And I finally, it's not that I expect you to know anything, because let's be quite frank, I don't, and even based on your rank, I'm sure you've never had access. I'm sure you've never been briefed on the incident. Right. I don't expect you to know anything, but yet he would skirt the issue by constantly and boldly suggesting that we have in our possession physical evidence. Now, is that as close as one may get to acknowledging Roswell or any other crash retrieval incident?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's confessing to the possibility that beyond a light in the sky that is just a fleeting glimpse of something, or even a physical trace landing case that may have left some broken branches and depressed grass in the ground, that type of thing. No, we're talking about hardware. We're talking about, again, kicking the tires on the car across the street. And Lou was publicly proclaiming that. Now, was he tossing me a bone? Possibly. But nonetheless, he didn't recant, he didn't retract, because then the next interview, he said it again. And he said it over the course of a year.
Yeah.
So with whose permission? Now, is it, again, testing the waters? Is it seeing what the media does with? Because we both know, Peter, it didn't inspire anyone in the media to say, well, we need to look into Roswell a little deeper. We need to, be part of this investigation of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, or even Groom Lake, Area 51, and see what they maybe have hidden.
Yeah.
Fast away after all these years. I have yet to see that report. I think George Knapp may, jump at such an opportunity, but we know how far that would get. He'd get the door slammed in his face just as we would. So who dangled that carrot? Lou was the spokesperson, but who instructed him to say and admit what he did? And now that he has either been thrown under the bus or he's gone into some form of protective custody or some type of like a police protection situation, we don't know. And I need to make some phone calls. I need to, in fact, I haven't attempted to even call him in recent months, so I need to do that. But we've seen this before. We've seen where we've had someone who appears to finally extend the hand of cooperation just to have them snatched away, disappear. Or I can't tell you how often, Peter, we have had Roswell witnesses who were ready to go public, high-ranking military. And we would be, and then one occasion, it was to accompany us to Washington to actually go on the record and to give them another call. And they would come on the line and say, don't you ever call this number again. If you ever call, I will report you to the police. I have nothing more to say to you. I regret that I ever said anything, and don't you ever call again. Been there dozens of times. So it's like we can speculate to a certain extent, but it's like, yeah, but I've lived it. I've seen it. You've seen it, where you've had a witness that all at once disappears. And all we can hope is that they're safe, that harm has not come to them or one of their loved ones, which drove them into silence.
You know, I think a lot of people who have no reason to think otherwise would see such claims as exaggerations or a romanticizing of what we do, or individuals trying to make themselves seem more important than they were. But the fact is, what you're saying is simply the truth. And you do encounter it in this work. And for anybody that thinks for a moment that even if we love our country, we don't love our country right or wrong, there are things where we have to come down on one side or another. And I think one of the most valuable things that you and Tom Carey, who you've written so many important, moving, extremely educational books.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, it's simply a fact. You've earned the every bit of praise that you get about it, and you're a remarkable writing team. That there are, for lack of a better term, I can't even say bad guys, but people who are involved professionally in scaring people and making them be quiet.
There is a dark side to all this. And if I could cite, just two contemporary examples, just imagine someone with the reputation, a former presidential candidate, a 2-star general, a major general, head of the Armed Services Committee, and we're talking about the late Senator Barry Goldwater. And for nothing more than asking at that time, chair of the Joint Chiefs, and he was before that Deputy Director of Research and Development, Curtis LeMay. I'd like to see the evidence. I'd like to see what you have at Wright-Patterson that you're not disclosing to the world. And he's told, hell no, don't ever bring this up again. And if you ever broach the subject again, I will personally see you court-martialed. Well, just imagine, it's so important that a higher-ranking officer would threaten court-martial for nothing more than bringing up this taboo subject that SETI and the debunkers and everyone else can just sweep under the carpet as though it's just so much nonsense. But then Senator Barry Goldwater is told you'll be court-martialed for just bringing it up.
A reserve general in the United States Air Force, and again, being threatened over something that the premise is doesn't exist. Let's remember, or is a misunderstood, poor crashed weather balloon.
Right.
We can joke about it, but this is effing madness. It makes no sense whatsoever. And I think we all grow up, many of us do, with a sense of respect for authority, unless we grow up with a very different sense, and I can understand that too. But how authority is used to keep us deaf, dumb, and blind on certain subjects, and that pressure is always there in the background. And again, we've talked about this on different shows. You document it so brilliantly in your books.
Thank you.
I want to talk about somebody who's out there with a government background who most people are listening to and who has a rather unique position in this work, and one that is evolving as we move forward. And that's Chris Mellon.
Mm-hmm.
You've spent time with Christopher Mellon?
No, I have not so much as had a phone conversation or any form of correspondence, because he too, he's come late to the game.
Yeah.
And yet, as even his editorial statement in the Wall Street Journal, if that's correct.
Yeah.
He truly is championing, our situation, and that he's going after like Seth Shulchak as far as like at SETI and others, that who are you to tell us what is actually going on when you've never been to the scene of the crime, so to speak. You've never even been to the state, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that you're the ones that are instructing us as what we should and what we shouldn't believe. You are the charlatans. You are the phonies, the hacks, who continue for no other reason than you're on the government dole. You're getting grants. You're getting special funding. It's your meal ticket. That's all it is to you. Don't ever talk about how the Christopher Mellons are profiting for promoting and advocating the truth about this subject.
Yeah.
It may come at a certain point, but at the moment, they're being attacked. They're being ridiculed. Yeah. And we're all being lumped in as being part of this cabal that are somehow, trying to overthrow their legitimate search for extraterrestrial intelligence, when I'm sorry, they have failed miserably over the last 30 some years, and there's no sign that they're ever going to come up with anything.
I would suggest, even right now as we chat, people go on Google or whatever your favorite search engine is and just type in Christopher Mellon. Get an idea of the background of this extraordinary public servant. He also happens to come from one of the most quietly powerful and influential families in the United States of America. He's smart, he's curious, and thankfully, he's a great communicator and a very good writer. And I just want to take a couple of minutes here and read the beginning of this new piece, because it is important and it's a good springboard for what may be coming at us over the next 18 months. This was published just on Christmas Eve, and it's called Unprecedented UAP Legislation by Christopher Mellon. Unbeknownst to most Americans, President Biden just signed into law far-reaching legislation that could soon confirm the existence of an alien presence on Earth. Talk about not pulling your punches.
Right.
The relevant, he says it like it is. The relevant provisions incorporated into legislation needed to provide funding for the Department of Defense and the intelligence community enjoy strong bipartisan support in both the House and Senate. This is arguably the biggest story mainstream news organizations have ever failed to cover. Among other things, this new legislation, 1, provides greatly enhanced authorities and resources for the, quote, All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, which now reports directly to the leaders of the Defense Department and the intelligence community. The organization's unusual name is intended to clarify that its purview extends to anomalous objects regardless of their location, land, air, undersea, or space. 2, mandates a review of all intelligence documents involving UAPs from 1945, as you noted, to present. Requires the Department of Defense, the DHS, and the intelligence community to identify any non-disclosure agreements related to UAP and provide those to the new AARO office. 4, directs the new AARO office to develop a UAP science plan to assess the sometimes mysterious and mind-bending capabilities being reported, as well as a collection plan to leverage America's vast technological intelligence apparatus to determine where these objects are coming from and their capabilities and intent. This aggressive UAP investigation using America's unparalleled intelligence capacities is what I hoped to accomplish when I brought the famous DoD UAP videos, gimbal and flare, and Lou Elizondo to the New York Times and the Oversight Committee on Capitol Hill in December of 2017. Recall that Mr. Elizondo had just resigned his position on the staff of the Secretary of Defense in protest over the DoD inaction in the face of innumerable violations of restricted DoD airspace by UAP. And to complete this part of this terrific article, 5, provides a secure process for anyone who has signed an official a U.S. government security agreement related to UAP to come forward and reveal this information to AARO and to Congress, regardless of the level of classification, without fear of retribution or persecution. This provision is intended to determine the veracity of longstanding allegations indicating that the U.S. government has recovered extraterrestrial technology and perhaps even extraterrestrial beings. The alleged UAP crash in 1947 near Roswell, New Mexico, offers the most famous example, but there are many others, and they go on from there. It goes on from there. This is paradigm shifting. This is major. Can we talk about this? Because it's starting to roll now. It's an 18-month process that is just kicking in now.
Concerned on 2 fronts. It's like, when does Washington often put out a story when they want the least media attention? A Friday afternoon. This was Christmas Eve. And most likely, I would question, Chris, when did you submit the article? And did they sit on it until Christmas Eve? So again, we know that the media have been willing accomplices for many years. They get their marching orders. They have not been on our side. We could count the number of legitimate journalists working with us on one hand. And as a result, I feel that we're the ones that are going to have to bring this to the forefront. We're the ones that are going to have to emphasize this at every turn. Every show, every interview we do, we need to bring this article up, because we see post-holiday the media reaction. There is no media reaction. I mean, if this would have been a statement to the contrary, the media would have accepted it as the final word. I guess that wraps up that. We're done with it. But anything that advocates the position that the media needs to look into this, we need to start putting the pressure on our elected officials to jointly ask the right questions once and for all. Grant immunity to the whistleblowers, and it will be a domino. It will be an avalanche. It will just then, there will be as far as ammunition that it will just take care of itself.
Yeah. The power of opening that door. I mean, we have long fantasized. There's no other word for it about, gee, maybe someday everybody who has had to take a security oath on this on penalty of God knows what might be given free run. That, like when legislation around marijuana is changing and people who were jailed on these offenses are now being released because the law, it's a very different thing. But in fact, that sense of forgiveness in a way. As you know, last year I was preoccupied in part, as far as presentations went, with the origins of UFO ridicule. And for me, one of the results of going back to why this happened, how it happened, where it happened, why it was so successful, and what set it in motion was a thought that really had not occurred to me until I got that much deep into the hows and the whys, that we need to step back a step from our historically entrenched positions of how dare they clamp down on this subject in 1947 and keep it from us. The world has evolved in a perverted manner. And we can't imagine what would have happened if a few months after Roswell, President Truman came forward and just said what we knew, which was that we don't know much, but something major has happened here. We can't imagine how different the world would have evolved. But we don't allow ourselves to think like Truman and those 12 lonely men around him at that moment in history. And I don't want to, again, romanticize or just make excuses for them, but to begin to understand what they felt that they were faced with, and that they couldn't handle it. And the best thing they could figure out was sit on it and try to figure out how to handle it. And here we are all these years later, decades later, still not handling it. No. But again, trying to a degree. I think you'll agree with me that one of the most healthy aspects of this opening, rocky as it's been over the last 5 years, has been the inadvertent connections and agreements it has created between political figures who, sadly, in American politics today, have become enemies, who have rejected, to a degree, compromise and the notion that it's all about winning and losing, which is terrible for democracy, as opposed to we have to meet in the middle on certain things, or else we have to just kill the other side off completely and then start fighting with ourselves about the nuances. The fact that somebody like a Marco Rubio, a conservative Republican from Florida, and one of my senators, Kirsten Gillibrand, who got an extraordinary crash course in the study of what we're talking about, and is responsible for a mind-blowingly detailed bill of over 100 pages to move forward, but bringing people at different ends of the political spectrum together is a good thing. And if it's this subject that's doing it, all the better.
Of course. And again, none of us would have predicted this before 5 years ago. And I think back, and we both recall the MJ-12 documents when they went public in 1987.
Oh, yeah.
And I was heavily involved. I was flying back and forth to California and meeting with two of the main proponents at the time. That was my assignment as far as after Hynek had passed away, and working with QFOS at that time. And I had gone to Congressman James Sensenbrenner with the documents, copies of the documents in hand, and I portrayed them as two reasons for his involvement: either that someone is falsifying classified documents, or someone is releasing classified documents, and both would be a class 1 felony. And he was, profusely agreeing with me that, oh yes, Don, we need to look into this immediately. And we shook hands, but I was smart enough that when I left his office, I backed up into the doorway just as he was crunching them all up, tossing them in the waste paper basket.
Oh no.
So we went through that for many years. And having worked with late Congressman Stephen Schiff, we had talked about Senator Goldwater. I saw the same thing with Congressman Schiff, who we worked with personally. That he wasn't getting any allies, he wasn't getting any support on Capitol Hill. This time it's different. As far as you and I both are concerned, the taboo has been lifted. People that were never comfortable discussing this subject before are now openly discussing it. We may disagree as to the possibilities, but the fact that the phenomenon has now been acknowledged. Something is there. It's no longer weather balloons. It's no longer lights in the sky. It's something that is interacting with our aircraft, the best we put up in the sky. It's able to outmaneuver, outperform anything that we put in the sky. Yeah. It's able to shut down Atlas nuclear missiles. It's able to demonstrate itself on radar. It's able to demonstrate that it's of an intelligence beyond our own comprehension. We're all in kindergarten right now, including the Pentagon, as far as I'm concerned, because as I've often discussed with you, Peter, I still feel it's a cover-up of ignorance. They have the hardware, but they still can't find the on button. They still don't know what we're dealing with. And yet that they're in a position, what can we disclose when we don't have any answers? We need to come together. We need to work together. And that's where Capitol Hill, beyond the Pentagon and beyond NASA, they need to also be talking to us, because we've been manning the store all these years. Yeah. They've been dabbling. They've been occasionally perusing the subject. We've lived it. Yeah. And our witnesses that we could provide could give them the best firsthand accounts they have ever heard.
As you and I know, there are countries in the world, governments that have been with us for a long time, who have one by one started taking this subject extremely seriously.
Absolutely.
And as we evolve in our education in the field of UFO studies, at a certain point we learn about countries like Brazil, going back to the 1950s, where not only do they take this seriously as a philosophical possibility, but as a reality, with important case information, often in the past, certainly, coming out of the office of the president. And you may remember with me the Stephen Bassett's extraordinary disclosure event, not that many years ago, that we both took part in. There were two witnesses, and there were 40-odd witnesses. We were privileged to be civilian witnesses, but many of them were government witnesses and in military, and a handful of military pilots. I do not remember whether it was Brazil or Peru or Chile. It was a South or Central American country. And what we learned in their testimony was that they had both been scrambled. They had both seen an anomalous object as they approached it. They were not able to fire on it, and it didn't function. But the thing that I will not forget was they both mentioned that if they had a quiet day, they would sometimes have an assignment from their chief of staff or whatever to go give a talk at a local high school on the seriousness of the reality of UFOs. And I thought, can you imagine that in America? A couple of Air Force pilots on a day off giving a briefing to high school students on the reality of truly anomalous structured craft. we have a lot that we can learn from other governments. And Lord knows saying that has not caused riots or crises or had people burning down high schools or, drinking themselves to death or going to church and staying there. This can be accommodated.
And it's the reason is for both of us that we have always relished the opportunity of speaking in public, and even at the elementary level, young children.
Yeah.
And I often would remind them next time they're out looking at a starlit sky that many of those stars that they observe for the moment no longer exist. Time is relevant. You're looking back in time. And the thought that as you may even wave at those stars, that there may be some young lad waving back from hundreds of millions of miles away. So we get into their minds, at least accepting the notion that when we listen to officialdom, this essentially from the moment we're born to the moment we die, and we entrust them with our very well-being, both mentally and physically. That, as the old saying, anytime the government arrives and says, we're only here to help you, grab your wallet and run the other way.
Don?
Because we have a long history of the government doing the opposite. Self-preservation, deception, and too often using American citizens as guinea pigs.
Yeah.
That's why when you bring up like the citizens hearing in 2013, we impressed those Congress people.
You bet.
I mean, the fact that Congressman Cook and then Senator Mike Gravel, even after the fact, all of a sudden they're attending UFO conferences.
Yes.
Because they realized, my God, we sat here in Washington and we didn't hear any of this.
And we're allowed now to be curious. We don't have to worry about losing our job or have poked fun at behind our back. We are all now officially allowed to be curious. And that's an important state to be in. Don, as we come into our last minute or two here, any particular place where people can look forward to seeing you in the upcoming year that you know of right now? I know you're still booking.
I had a good discussion with my partner, my investigative partner, my writing partner, Tom Carey, this morning. And we basically, because we've talked about this for some months, but okay, we're laying out plans for the year. And Peter, to be honest with you, we're talking about research trips. We're talking about still following up on things that we need to finalize,
That's
that we
great.
need closure. And I mean, granted, we still have lecture work and wonderful opportunities like tonight with you, Peter, but we're still in the race. As much as we've lost the race with The Undertaker, we still have all those great basket issues that we're now going back to. And
Don,
so there will be, and
and we seem to have just lost Don instead of me. If we don't recover him, Don Schmitt, thank you so much for being our guest tonight. Don's website is roswellinvestigator.com. And here he is coming right back in. Don's website is roswellinvestigator.com. Next week's guest will be Dan Madsen. Dan is a writer, producer, publisher, editor, actor, and the founder of the official fan clubs for Star Trek, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Back to the Future, among others, founder and producer of the first Star Wars celebration, and played the part of Dam's Denna, the Cadu handler, in Star Wars Episode 1 of The Phantom Menace, and These Things Just for Starters. Don Schmitt, thank you for joining me tonight. All the rest of you, I hope your year is off on a great start. Stand up for what you believe in. Stay well and be kind to each other. We'll see you next week.